Okay, what is up there, YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on one of the least documented firearms designer in American history, and especially during the firearms development era of the early to mid Cold War era of 1945 through 1960. And that man is Loren C. Cook, who was the designer of a variety of early Cold War weapons that were submitted to the U.S. Army and U.S. Armed Forces for testing during the era before and during the Korean War of 1950 through 1953. Now, Loren C. Cook was a major sergeant in the U.S. Army, and he was actually stationed in California. He was one of many members of what was known as the Benicia Arsenal, based in California. Now, between 1948 and 1954, Loren C. Cook actually submitted a variety of different experimental weapons to the U.S. Army to be adopted and potentially used both before and during the Korean War of 1950 through 1953. So let's go over some of the rare weapons of Loren C. Cook. And the first weapon on the list is the Cook Model 1949, and this was an experimental semi-automatic battle rifle designed between 1948 and 1949. This weapon was chambered for the standard .30-06 Springfield cartridge and was fed by 20-round BAR magazines, the same magazines used in the Browning automatic rifle. This weapon had an effective range of between 600 and 1,500 yards, and it was one of many semi-automatic rifles that were submitted as a potential replacement for the M1 Garand. Keep in mind, this was developed during the same time as the early M14 prototypes, for example, the X8 as it was known. And this weapon was also tested by the U.S. Army between 1949 and 1950, just before the start of the Korean War. Now, the weapon was an okay weapon, but keep in mind, the U.S. Army was already planning on adopting the M14, but they were still in the early testing phases of developing various M14 prototype weapons, for example, the T-28 series of experimental select-fire battle rifles. So the Army probably wasn't going to adopt this weapon, but it was a good substitute for the M1 Garand. This weapon reminds me of the Belgium FN-FAL, but this was pretty much the American equivalent designed by Loren C. Cook just before the Korean War. And this weapon was ultimately rejected. Recently, back in 2016, this weapon was actually sold at an auction for about $2,000. Whoever owns this rifle today actually owns one of the many experimental rifles that were designed to replace the M1 Garand, and that came before the M14. During the same time period of 1949, the Cook submitted a second version of his Model 1949 rifle, and this was the Cook Model 1949 Pattern 2. And this was actually a slightly different weapon. It was a semi-automatic rifle still, but it had the ability to be fed by either 10 to 20 round magazines. So this weapon was a more simplified version of the previous weapon. The weapon also had an effective range of between 600 and 1,500 yards, but just like the previous version of this weapon was also not adopted, and this weapon came just 1 year before the Korean War. Now imagine if U.S. soldiers in the Korean War had this weapon, either of these two Cook model semi-automatic rifles instead of the old M1 Garand. They probably would have had a much better weapon than the standard M1 Garand. You know, the M1 Garand was a good weapon, but this weapon used the BAR magazine, so it could be used alongside the Browning automatic rifle, which was still in service during the Korean War. But ultimately, both of these two prototype semi-automatic rifles were rejected. In 1951, Loren C. Cook submitted another another experimental rifle, and this time it was a Bullpup rifle known as the Cook Model 1951, sometimes called the Cook Model 1954. Now, this weapon was designed between 1950 and 1952. Some other sources state that this weapon was designed between 1952 and 1954, but this weapon was designed during the Korean War. And this was a Bullpup modification of the Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, which was the standard squad automatic rifle being used by the U.S. Army during World War I, II, and during the early part of the 1950s, before the BAR was eventually replaced by the M14. This weapon also used the standard 20-round BAR magazines and had a rate of fire of about 500 to 600 rounds per minute, just like the standard BAR series. And this weapon was pretty much a lighter Browning automatic rifle in a Bullpup configuration. This is actually one of my favorite Korean War era prototypes that never made it. But ultimately, this weapon was rejected just like the previous two Cook rifles. But it was at least a much more interesting design than the standard semi-automatic prototypes that were being produced at this time. Lawrence C. Cook also developed several submachine gun prototypes, and these were all telescoping bolt submachine guns, similar to the Uzi and other submachine guns being developed around the same time period. And the first one was the Cook Model 1, also known as the Cook Model 1950, or sometimes referred to as the Benicia Arsenal Model 1950. And this was a prototype or experimental machine pistol designed in 1950, the start of the Korean War. There were two versions of this gun, one chambered in the 9x19mm Parabellum, and a second version chambered in the .45 ACP. These guns were fed by either 32-round 9mm magazines or 20 to 30 round M3 grease gun magazines or Thompson submachine gun magazines. They had a rate of fire of between 500 and 550 rounds per minute and an effective range of 150 yards. These were some of the more advanced submachine gun prototypes designed during the late 40s and early 50s. Keep in mind, the US wouldn't have a standard issued telescoping bolt submachine gun until the Mac 10 and the Mac 11 series later on in the 1960s and 70s. So this weapon actually was 10 to 15 years, older than this telescoping bolt submachine guns that we would develop later on during the middle part of the Cold War, towards the middle and later era of the Cold War. So it was a pretty cool and interesting design, but ultimately it was rejected. There was a second version of this gun designed in 1951, known as the Cook Model 1951, and this was a standard machine pistol, as in it was no longer a telescoping bolt submachine gun. Instead, it was a submachine gun that had a standard pistol grip. And this weapon was also submitted for testing, and both of these weapons were ultimately rejected. And it was actually kind of a shame. I actually wish this weapon was used in the Korean War. Just imagine if U.S. forces had this weapon in the Korean War alongside their M3 grease guns, their Thompson submachine guns, and their Rising submachine guns. But ultimately, that didn't happen, and these weapons were pretty much abandoned after 1951. Now, later on in 1954, Cook resubmitted his Bullpup Browning automatic rifle project. That too was rejected a second time. And in 1954, Major Sergeant Lawrence C. Cook finally resigned from his post. He was in the U.S. Army both as a soldier, but he also was trying to promote his own firearms design and his own firearms firm, the Benicia Arsenal, based in California. And that's basically it for the rare weapons designed by Lawrence C. Cook. And that was this video on the Cook experimental weapons of 1948 through 1954. Which of these were your favorite? If you ask me, I actually like the Cook machine pistol and the Browning automatic Bullpup configuration designed by Lawrence C. Cook sometime between 1951 and 1954. But what were your favorites of these prototypes? Please tell me in the comment section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time signing off.